From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We are joined, as always, with our super producer, Paul Mission Control Decant. Most importantly, you are you. You are here. That makes this the stuff they don't want you to know. And we want to do something very important at the top of tonight's exploration. We are talking about adoption, and we want to start off by saying adoption is an amazing thing. It can be a profound testament to the noble aspects of the human experiment. I was reading this old quote from an amateur wrestler who later became president, Abe Lincoln.
I thought you were going to say Jesse the Body Ventura. He didn't become president. He was just a governor.
Well, there's this concept in an inaugural speech that Lincoln makes about the better angels of our nature. And that quote stays with me. I think it stays with a lot of us. And adoption is one of the true real life examples of how people can be better than you would imagine them to be.
Yeah, we have several colleagues who have adopted, and we've kind of followed that trajectory from, all the paperwork and the craziness that goes into it. And it really does require a lot of effort. It can be very expensive and time consuming and ultimately disappointing for some who do not, actually get to the final stage. But it's a beautiful thing. Absolutely.
Yeah, several of our colleagues have multiple children that they've adopted and, have raised children all the way to adulthood.
It is just to say that, it is their child. You know what I mean? Because we get into this later in the show, but the idea of what adoption means, it is a lifelong pursuit simply because, it is giving all of yourself, to a human being in the same way you would if it were your own flesh and blood.
And this brings us to an astonishing moment. Right now, a lot of us listening along this evening may have been adopted, right? May have adopted children into their families. It's a win-win when it works. People who want nothing more than to be parents literally are saving the lives of children who want nothing more than to be part of a family. That's pretty cool.
Dude, my cousin is adopted, and she's my cousin. It's something that never crosses my mind. She is family through and through. There's no second-class nature to that relationship.
So it's crucial that we say all of this at the very beginning because we are exploring an extremely sensitive subject. This episode is in no way meant to diminish nor disparage the beauty in that. We will have a future exploration of the foster care system, which we're going to bracket here. You got to understand, fellow conspiracy realist, the reason we're talking so positively about adoption when it works is because sometimes it doesn't. Tonight, we are exploring the dark side of adoption. Here are the facts. All right, as we were saying earlier, we're throwing the word adoption around. What is it?
Adoption is when a human being assumes all the responsibilities of a child that the biological parents would have, according to the laws of wherever you're living. And it is a bit different than fostering. Maybe we should talk about the difference between adopting someone legally and then being a foster parent.
In the U.S. alone, tens of thousands of children are adopted each year, and that number becomes particularly impressive once we understand the regulations around who is allowed to adopt, along with the emotional and financial aspects of this relationship. Again, like I mentioned earlier, it is a significant expenditure for folks that are seeking to do this kindness, to another human being. It can take a very long time, and it can often be riddled with disappointment if things don't work out, despite the outlay of funds in order to participate in the process. So it is very significant in that respect, both emotionally and financially.
And to Matt's earlier point here, the difference between fostering a human being and adopting a human being. Let's just get that articulated really quick.
For sure. Fostering is more of a temporary sort of stopgap measure, whereas adopting is for the long haul.
Yeah, I think that's the primary difference really to point to here. When you choose to adopt, when an adult human being or human beings choose to adopt, it is that legal taking on of all responsibilities in perpetuity.
Filial responsibilities would be the word for this with a tie on is filial rights and responsibilities. There are rights included in this as well, which is historically mission critical. Our pal Jacob Silverman, utter legend, from our alma mater, How Stuff Works, describes adoption as a lifelong process. And I think that's an exceedingly accurate way to look at this. It's not an on and off switch. It's not a one afternoon in Burma kind of thing. The modern form of adoption as practiced today did emerge in the United States, go team, but versions of this have existed across human culture at every age of human history. I mean, I was looking back at the Code of Hammurabi because I'm fun at parties, and and adoption is mentioned in the first written instance of law. But adoption was very different in evenings past. A lot of it was meant to not necessarily create a family, but more so to do geopolitical or intertribal things. Like one of the big things was you had to have a male heir, right? You had to have a little guy to carry it on.
Well, yeah, and I think in the news right now, there's information circulating about Japan's only male heir has just become 18 or something, and it's a huge deal. And if you can only imagine, through all the centuries when monarchies prevailed in most parts of the world, having the rules that you got to have a male that takes over everything. It was a huge deal for a royal family in particular to have someone in line. And it is weird to think how people just could be pushed up and through that system if you did choose to adopt someone from another, close to royal family or something like that, to arrange for another person to take over once the crown, whoever dies.
Yeah, that's the thing. I was astonished to find a while back that some of the emperors of ancient Rome were on purpose adopted. By on purpose, I mean they were adopted not necessarily to be part of a family, but to continue some weird dynasty.
Well, because you could train them. Once you adopt that person, you can basically make them one of us, right?
Right. So who is free and who is a slave in the Roman Empire there? Fame is a cage. Let's remember that. Sadly, though, the adoption of infants, like in the modern evenings, a lot of times when folks are searching to adopt a child, they're looking for the youngest human possible. Infant adoption was kind of rare historically in the ancient empires. You might You might see cases where what we would call a foundling is taken in, raised as a member of the family, primarily because most people are like working in farms or agriculture and they want that free labor. Shout out also to a show Noel and I do called Ridiculous History. You can check out our brother Matt Frederick on that with one of my favorite sound cues. Noel, do you remember we did the story about the Orphan Train?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like the well-meaning, well-intentioned program in the United States to, the way I'm going to say it is going to sound well-meaning, but to round up children with seemingly having no parents and ship them off to work in farms. To be looked after by kindly farmer families. Again, well-intentioned. There were abuses. There was a lack of infrastructure that led to some issues with kids falling through the cracks. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it was at least a partial success story.
Noble intent. Better angels of our nature. They also did auction children. There was an auction. Yeah.
That's true.
I want to point out another thing that's in popular culture. It's a story that has been passed down for a long time where there are two warring factions and some child is left, in a village or something that has been raised by the enemy forces of that village. And there's a child there. One of the warlords or people end up adopting that child and they become like an apprentice and then moved up. And that's just a popular thing that occurs. That doesn't really, I don't know if there is any historical significance to that or if that is, a tale born of something that actually happened, but I know I see that a lot.
And another example, historically speaking, is, of course, Moses from the Bible, from the book of Exodus, who was, found as a babe in the rushes or whatever and adopted by a powerful family and then ultimately became a pretty important, powerful political figure. Let's just say.
Love it. We also know a great reference to Moses here because we also know that Moses lucked out or was predestined to have an extraordinary interaction with the world because for ages past around this part of Earth, abandoned kids were often not foundlings. They were often enslaved, and they actually, in the Roman Empire days, they formed a significant part of the supply chain of the Roman Empire's slave industry.
Yeah, slaves or soldiers, right? I mean, you're automatically conscripted now. Again, because of wartime interactions between families that would get slaughtered and then some children that would be left.
Every horrible thing that you can possibly imagine happening to someone in this situation did at some point occur. This is very unclean stuff. But let's look at other empires, civilizations in India and China. They also had ancient adoption practices. Again, they would seem very different to modern adoption practices because in a lot of cases, in those various civilizations, the idea was it was like insurance. The idea was to guarantee that when you died, correct funeral rites would be enacted. Someone would continue. Also, spoiler alert, a male heir specifically would be around to do the proper ancestor worship. Fall of Rome leads to a decline in adoption in Europe because, shout out to George R.R. Martin, the dominant cultures that rose from the flotsam and jetsam of the shipwrecked Roman Empire, those cultures in Europe, they put so much importance on bloodlines. Just like the ancient Egyptians, their thing was more incest is okay. Let's keep it in the family.
Let's do it. When you put it like that, Ben, it gives that a whole nother meaning, doesn't it?
Well, the thing is, I'm saying, like, in contrast to ancient Rome, in contrast to ancient civilizations in India or China, they weren't adopting. They weren't hiring from outside the network. And
by design, though, right? I mean, like, to your point, I mean, I was just saying, keeping it in the family when you start talking about incest just makes it kind of take on a little extra ick. But certainly the insular nature of these civilizations and these types of governments and powerful families, I mean, that's well established.
Yeah, agreed. Now, fast forward, there's a ton of other stuff that happens. We're here in 2024. We are coming to you from the United States. In the U.S., the adoption process varies state by state. The laws in Massachusetts may not be the same as the laws in Mississippi. If you are adopting children from another country, you have to abide by the laws and regulations of your child's birth country, which I think makes sense. I don't know.
It does. Well, you have to abide by both sets of laws, right? Adopting from another country is a whole other thing.
Yeah. Domestic adoption is the process of assuming the filial rights and responsibilities for a kid who is in the same country as you. Foster adoption is, again, I think we're accurate the way we put it. Foster adoption is not necessarily permanent. It can evolve into a permanent adoption. International adoption is when you assume those filial rights and responsibilities for a kid from a different country. And typically, those kids are going to be in an orphanage. They may be in foster care. They may have no real family support network. It's not a mandatory part of the process for adoption, but most people, the vast majority of families adopting a child, will work with things we call adoption agencies.
Sure. And we have some friends and colleagues that have gone through that process as well, that we've witnessed. And it is a lot of red tape, let's just say.
Yeah. And many states have their own kind of systems for that and agencies for that.
Yes. And even now in the United States, some of those, let's call them brokering partners or facilitators, are heavily religious. They're based in religion. Everybody's got their own spiritual system. We just have to note that it is really important to understand that.
Well, I think whatever, your views on religion might be, it's important to acknowledge that there are religious organizations that at their heart, are out to do good and to help people.
Yeah, well said. And so we're saying there's a long, at times astonishing history of human beings providing care for children that might not otherwise get the one thing everyone deserves: a decent shot at a life well lived. When everything goes as it should, we bear witness to this fundamental, I'm not sure, something better than beauty. I'm not sure what the right word is, but this fundamental, noble aspect of the human experiment. Our question tonight: what happens when things go wrong?
We'll find out after a quick word from our sponsor.
Here's where it gets crazy. All right. Doesn't always go as planned. Yeah.
Oh, of course. I don't know why, guys. I woke up watching Jim Carrey videos. I had a bit of a dream about him, and some of the things that he has been talking about over the past decade when he's, going and giving a speech for an award show, an award ceremony, or going on a talk show.
This kind of Zen phase that he's sort of entered, right?
Yeah, and he's gone now towards a more religious thing that I just don't know much about, but in that time period at least, he makes this beautiful point about, who was the point of consciousness that believes he's Jim Carrey and was playing the part of Jim Carrey and all this stuff. And when you think about just any of us, our identities, the things we hold dear, the things we believe, the way we feel about anything, it all is shaped by the human beings that are around us, the thoughts that enter our brains, the words that are said to us, the actions that we observe. And when you take on these responsibilities through adoption, you are you are taking the responsibility of shaping another consciousness, right? I mean, at the heart of it. And it's as we've said, and Ben, you're just talking about trying to find the right word for what is that? How do you describe that process? Is it beautiful? Is it astonishing? Like, what is that thing? And I don't have the right word for it besides it's a responsibility, that word responsibility.
It's all encompassing is what it is, right? I mean, it's everything. You're shaping a life.
Absolutely. And unless you feel that weight and you're prepared for that responsibility, as you said, Ben, it can go very wrong, and it can go extremely wrong if there are bad intentions somewhere along that path.
Yeah. What we're saying here is there are ongoing, provable, egregious problems with aspects of the adoption industry, especially on a global level. A lot of these issues echo historical instances of corruption and crime and conspiracy. These unclean things often continue in the modern day. Let's talk about forced adoption, right? That's the immediate dark side, right? Like back in the evenings of the Roman Empire and Indian and Chinese civilizations, and honestly, the world over, these kids didn't have a right to consent. You know what I mean? The parents didn't have the right to say, hey, it's okay to adopt my kid. They were murdered in war. You know what I mean? They were conquered by blood and treasure. And one of the most, I would argue, one of the most immediately recognizable recent examples of this is in North America, in the United States. Well, the Anglosphere overall, arguably, in the United States and in Canada, Native American children, right?
Yeah, we talked recently, I think, in Strange News about an update to the story of these Native American schools built in order to assimilate Native American children, and just how many children died under tragic circumstances within these institutions. For decades, the U.S. government abducted thousands of Native children and forced them into those boarding schools where the goal was to, again, just assimilate them, strip them entirely of their culture, their language, their customs, and essentially erase their history entirely. This was an organized attempt at cultural erasure. At the peak of this era, there were more than 350 Native American boarding schools across the United States, and this also took place in a slightly different arrangement over in Canada.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about 350 different schools. In my mind, at least when we were first learning about this, I imagined a dozen, maybe a few dozen schools that existed like on the frontiers of wherever the United States territory was expanding or something. But no. This is 350 different schools that were doing the same process.
That we know about.
Exactly.
Which is terrifying.
Well,
right?
and we've just learned how many of these schools had literally a makeshift graveyard, or
yes.
Using the word graveyard is probably overstating it.
Burial site. Mass graves.
Mass graves of children that would just basically disappear. Not only from their families when they were taken into one of these schools, but now from all of history because they died in whatever circumstance while they're at the school, and now they're just buried.
Right. Not necessarily someone purposely murdering these children, but
not
things
necessarily
like disease or lack of sanitation, right? These programs also were often, we don't want to, step on any crosses here, but they were often church-led. They were led by the Christian church of some doctrine or denomination, and they occurred in step with a larger push to encroach upon tribal land through kinetic war, through insidious policies, and as ever, breaking promises and treaties.
I mean, if anyone had a chance to see Killers of the Flower Moon, you see how that assimilation was utterly taken advantage of in order to rob these individuals of their tribal land and their wealth, especially in areas where that land may have sat upon oil reserves or other precious mining materials.
Yeah. There's a great Netflix show I've been watching recently, and I don't have a lot of time to watch these things, but it's called Dark Winds. Have you guys heard of this?
I saw it advertised. I'd like to check it out.
It's a banger. I've got to read the books it's based on, but there's your concept of oil exploration or resource extraction reminds me of this. It's just, it's so good. Anyway, in a totally different thing, most people nowadays in the U.S. know about these sins of the government. However, you might be surprised to learn there were weaponized policies and initiatives created not to dance around this idea of assimilation and forced adoption, but to do it blatantly, upfront, on purpose. The Indian Adoption Project would steal children from native families and purposely place them with families they considered, let's call it, white enough.
Right.
Yeah. And the thing is, they're not orphans. They're not, they have parents, and the parents were trying to get their kids back. And in many cases, they simply could not because the system was rigged against them. It reminds me of, not to get too political, it reminds me of what's happening in recent years with Russia and Ukraine.
I can only imagine it occurred a lot during the years of the Crusades, where maybe, Catholic armies would roam through and find children and then assimilate them.
Yeah, it's a scary thing, because also these folks, we have to understand, are making a greater good argument. They're saying, well, usually we kill the children. Now we're doing something different.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's less on paper horrifying than genocide, but kind of has a similar outcome.
It's genocide with more steps.
Yeah, it's like psychological genocide in a way. It's very bizarre and unclean, as you would say, Ben.
Yeah, so say we all. We also know that in Australia, which has its own intensely disturbing history with the people who were already living in Australia for thousands of years, and as well as in the United Kingdom, similar practices of forced adoption occurred. Surprising to learn, perhaps, that the practice of forced adoption continued up until the 1970s in Britain. We're talking 250,000 mothers were forced to give up their children, not because they were criminals, not because they did anything bad, but because they were not married. They were single moms, and that meant they could not be moms.
Yikes. I think, and it's shown in a couple of places, you can look it up right now, that the anti-abortion movements within any country will often push rates of adoption much higher. And it is often based on this same kind of thing that was happening in Britain, where some what would you call it, a moray?
Sure.
Something was violated, right, in the consummation of this child. So adoption is the correct move, at least so say the prevailing religious ideals.
Right. Yeah. Most of these families were broken up with birth mothers who were under 24 and unmarried. And it does appear there was an active conspiracy to pressure these young people into conforming, right? The nail that stands out shall be hammered down. And that the monarchy was doing that. Similar practices occur again in cultures the world round. This is not a glass house situation. It never is. It's a glass planet. Most of the countries are committing the same sins at some point. Around the same time, 1960s, Chile, largely poor, young, indigenous women are either forced to give up their biological children, or their children are stolen from them. This is true right after childbirth. They told the mothers that the kids had died and they just took the kids. And then, just like in the US, they often sterilized the birth mothers while they had them on the operating table. There are so many other cases. Argentina as well. We're not going to explore that tonight, but please do investigate the dirty war on your own, as it's called. We have to understand that there are adoption conspiracies. They are real, and they are evil things. That leads us to the next related branch here. Not just forced adoption, but child abduction, human trafficking. We're going to pause for a word from our sponsors. Please, please, please consider this the disclaimer. We are going to talk about, again, unclean things.
And we're back. Let's just rip the Band-Aid off. Human trafficking. For many families in the West, international adoption of a child, can feel like a moral act, a moral imperative. As so often is noted, the world is absolutely full of children who are not wanted, are not loved, and do need help. Therefore, the question kind of naturally arises, why should we create a child when we could save one that already exists? Perhaps orphaned by neglect, war, living in war zones, constantly at risk, disease, any number of scenarios. What can we do as individuals with means to make a positive difference, especially when it comes to helping a child in need, rescuing a child perhaps from a brutal situation? Unfortunately, though, as often tends to be the case, where there are good intentions and folks with means, there are often other folks there to intercept that situation and twist it to their own despicable ends.
Yeah. It's just, I hate to say this because I know our job is to articulate things here, but I don't have the words in this language to describe situations where you see human children treated like stray dogs. And that does happen. And it is an abomination. In some cases, we may be talking about children who require medical care that is simply beyond the reach of their social structure, right? Or their biological family. And if you adopt these kids, then you may be able to give them the care and the treatment that they need. Again, a noble imperative. There is no argument that in hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of cases, adoptive families make an enormous and positive difference for the world. However, again, it's not always the case. What if these children are adopted by bad faith actors? What if these kids already have parents? Were those biological parents allowed to consent to this adoption?
Well, as we said at the very top of the episode, if you are choosing to go through the process of international adoption, you're not only choosing to trust the agency you're going through from whatever country you're in, you're also choosing to trust the agency or the group or the individuals on the other end of this weird bargain that you're making. You're trusting that they have good intentions and they have taken actions that are correct through whatever system they're operating under and through whatever laws that are applicable there. And as well as just the moral stuff. Like, how is this child coming into this situation?
Yeah. What will this child remember? What will they recollect? And the main thing we have to note here is that when these conspiracies occur, it's almost never the adoptive family. They are good faith actors. They are, to your point, Noel, the idea of saying, hey, why would we make a kid when we can help one that already exists? We see time and time again that people run into the wrong end of the conspiracy here. There's a guy named David Smolin, who is the director of the Center for Children, Law, and Ethics over at Stanford University. Back in 1998, the Smolin family adopted 2 children from India, sisters. And later they learned that these children were stolen from their birth mother. I can't imagine the weight of this tragedy. Like we're saying, maybe a billionaire or an emperor adopts children on a whim, but most people are treating this very seriously. And can you imagine, can you imagine what happens when you learn that you have non-consensually become the quote unquote bad guy?
That's an intense story. There's an NPR article you can look up if you would like to learn more about this from July 2007 titled An Adoption Gone Wrong. That's a harrowing tale there.
There's also something that comes up again and again, the idea of providing a human child with a family rather than a life in an institution. You can read about, for instance, in certain circumstances during the Cold War, which hasn't stopped, there, like in countries that said AIDS doesn't exist, then children who were born with HIV were just raised in institutions. They did not have the opportunity for the formative care that fundamentally sort of makes a person a person. Like institutions are a bad place for a kid to grow up. If anybody here who has an office job, imagine you were born in your office. You never got to leave your office. You didn't have any parental figures. You had like a boss, and you had, an HR or something like that.
Or a bunch of nuns.
Or a bunch of really cartoonishly pissed off nuns. Yeah.
Or very sweet nuns. And, maybe that's,
all right,
maybe it's
you're
great.
Right. You're right. You're right. I'm being a jerk. You're right, Matt.
Well, we've certainly talked about situations where the church can do great good, facilitate great acts of charity and kindness. And we've also certainly seen the flip side of that, where religious institutions can do great damage and great harm and great disservices to, innocence.
Yeah. And when we talk about the dangers of being raised in an institution or a system versus as our pal Lauren would say, an actual facts family, we're not just talking about psychological damage. We're not talking mental or cognitive challenges alone. We're also talking about clearly traceable physical hazards for these humans as they develop. You can read fascinating and intensely disturbing studies of the long-term post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome and related stuff that hits people who, for instance, grow up in a persecuted minority demographic, or people who grow up in institutions. They're going to have higher rates of heart disease. They're going to have higher rates of diabetes. What we're saying is that if you have the privilege and the ability to adopt a kid, to save an innocent person from such a troubling thing, why would you not do it?
Let's jump really quickly, Ben. You found something about this in particular, that there are an estimated 8 million children growing up in some way like this that you're describing. And that is an estimate from UNICEF, originally the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. But this is, it's mind-boggling to imagine 8 million children growing up in something like at least what's described in the article you found, Ben, that Romanian boarding school of some sort. where it's just children who have learned to not cry because their cries are never attended to. So they're just silent. And then the children grow up that way. It's pretty horrifying.
Mm-hmm. And
truly,
sometimes it seems that kids being adopted, as you said, Matt, through these international brokers, may be products, commodities. They may be sold. There are multiple networks of conspirators that spend a great deal of time attempting to appear legit, attempting to appear like, hey, we're an NGO or a Gongo and we're helping because we, like you, want these kids to have a better life. Also, let's talk economics.
This is horrible. And I don't mean to downplay the severity of this situation we're describing, but there's so many parallels to the puppy mills industry
100%.
that exists. Just then applying that to humanity, it's just a whole other
level of evil.
Yeah.
The creatures doing these things do not differentiate between a human being and a dog.
That's why it's such a good parallel, Matt. And you're absolutely right. Because as far as they're concerned, it's just a business model that's probably even more lucrative.
Let's go back briefly to Chile. The provable conspiracy in Chile involved multiple actors. Now that's the most difficult bar for proving a genuine conspiracy. Multiple, like a multipolar network of people capable of not just keeping a secret, but also successfully accomplishing a task. It's a very difficult thing. It doesn't happen all the time. But in Chile, we're talking foster homes, hospitals, hotels, social workers, lawyers, judges, diplomats, all participating. And you can learn more about this by checking out the NGOs, the institutions that are now dedicated to helping these abducted children learn more about their past. The vice president of Connecting Roots, one of these organizations, Juan Luis Insulza, he noted that people and groups who participated in this criminal enterprise, this trafficking of children in Chile, they were under the protection of the Chilean state.
I mean, how much more twisted can you get? Whereas the body that is meant to protect children, that is meant to protect citizens, is actually colluding, with bad actors against them. And we're certainly not naive. We know this kind of stuff happens, where there's two-faced individuals that are part of these governments that are acting as though they're, there for the greater good, but in fact, they're there for something entirely different and much more insidious and self-serving.
Yeah, there's a title for this, at least in the United States law books, titled Adoption Deception, as a specific type of conspiracy and crime that can be committed. I was just looking at it specifically in Louisiana, guys, because I was remembering some of these tales of adoption agencies / religious groups, or at least front-facing religious groups that were taking children and abusing them. And then there are multiple instances of popular culture in television and film that, use these stories as the basis of a fictional story that they're telling.
Yeah. We see it in fiction because the truth exists, right? Because the nonfiction informs the explorations. And this is, I would say the folks creating that fiction are doing a great service because they are informing the public, right? Making you think twice when you get a letter from an organization you've never heard of with an innocuous name, right? That somehow relates to religion, wants a little money from you, might help you adopt a child. There's a magnitude of crime here. And people who, in the case of Chile, around the world, individuals and sometimes other adoption agencies were misled. Like you said, they were victims of adoption deception, or deceived about the origin of these kids. And let's focus on the kids. These kids are humans. They grow up, they have adventures, they live, they fall in love, they have their shipping story and so on. And then imagine you are, what's a good age? What's like a good human age?
Oh, goodness.
Like adult human.
Oh, I don't know. Let's just say quintessential 21.
All right. Let's say you're 21 years old, and then you learn that not only, like, maybe you already knew you were a child of adoption, but then you learn that your biological parents have been trying to reach you for 20 years, and they've been searching for you. You know what I mean? That's scary, dude.
Well, it's also like so complicated because it's not the fault of your adoptive parents.
Not at all.
So then you're put in the middle where it's like this really complex range of emotions where you almost like resent your adoptive parents, even though they don't deserve that. And it's like, even if you know that, it doesn't mean that, like I always say, like intellect and feelings are two very different things. And it would just be such a mind F,
Yeah. And
I couldn't imagine being put in that situation. I don't know what I would do or how it would feel. It's too fraught.
Some boffins over at the United Nations back in 2022 argued that the entire practice of international adoption should be discontinued. I'm not sure if I agree with that, because again, it's a matter of saving lives. But they said that what they call illegal intercountry adoptions, quote, may constitute serious crimes such as genocide or crimes against humanity.
God, I think it's the same problem the Boy Scouts of America faced when they were first founded. Remember when we talked about that? The big problem they had is that just by the nature of the organization dealing with children, you would get bad actors because it was a voluntary system when you could join in to be a scout master, a scout leader, or local person in the organization. Just by the nature of the thing, there would be some people that got into it for the wrong reasons or for terrifying reasons or terrible reasons. The same thing with some of these agencies and systems that are being set up. You are going to have some people who are going to be bad actors. How the heck do you defend especially if you're talking about a massive organization? How do you defend it against something like that? I don't know. I don't have the answer.
I don't know if anyone does. That's the thing. These conspiracies are real. Do not forget that. We also keep in front of mind the parents, to your point, Noel, they're not in on some kind of grift. These are not Kissingers. They're not war criminals. They're not monsters. They are, by and large, super good parents. They are. They just are.
They are, but we cannot dismiss some of the other parts of adoption and foster care that we've seen where there are abusive relationships on the parent side. And again, that is, you have to be able to look at individual cases, right? And there are many individual cases where the children are specifically adopted and moved into a system with abusive parents that are on some kind of mission of their own, of whatever they're doing.
Right. With very little oversight.
Yeah.
Even in what we would call quote unquote developed countries. And that's part of why we're saving the foster care episode, which candidly is going to be difficult. Let's end on this positive note. There are good parents, right? And every kid deserves a chance. And if you suspect you or a loved one may be in a situation involving abduction or trafficking or bad faith actors in the realm of international adoption, don't hesitate to reach out. Weirdly enough, there are, for most countries that you can imagine, there is some sort of NGO that will attempt to help you. If you believe an adoption agency in the US or abroad may be involved in criminal activity, report the agency to law enforcement. Do not hesitate to do so, because the worst that will happen is if that agency is legit, they'll have to provide some paperwork. They'll have to do a couple extra emails, right? I think that's a very easy cost-benefit calculus.
Absolutely.
And if you are one of the millions of families who has adopted a child, if you are one of the millions of people who grew up in an adoptive family, please remember, you've already made the world a better place. Thank you for tuning in. This is only the beginning, as we were saying, of a larger conversation. We would love to hear from you. Stay tuned for our future episode on the foster care system. Be safe and reach out to us online. That's a weird segue for such a heavy episode.
Well, yeah, we'd love to hear positive stories.
Yeah, there we
go.
I
mean, I think that would be something really nice to share on one of our listener mail episodes. So if you've got a positive story, email us, call us, hit us up on social media, and we'll tell you how to do that.
That's right. You can find us all over the internet at the handle Conspiracy Stuff, where we exist on Facebook, where you can join in on the conversation in our Facebook group. Here's Where It Gets Crazy. Also on YouTube, where we have video content galore for you to enjoy, and X, FKA Twitter. On Instagram and TikTok, however, we are Conspiracy Stuff Show.
Our phone number is 1-833-STDWYTK. When you call in, it's a voicemail system. Give yourself a cool nickname and let us know in the message if we can use your name and message on the air. It's 3 minutes, so if you've got more to say than can fit in a 3-minute voicemail, why not instead shoot us a good old-fashioned email? We are
the entities that read every piece of correspondence we receive. Be aware, yet unafraid. Sometimes the void writes back. We'd love to hear from you. Conspiracy@iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.